All right, this is going to be the very last video in this assignment. I know, I'm sad too. What we're going to talk about today is sanding. And sanding, you really need to think about sanding as a progression, starting at one point, moving through several steps, and finally ending at another point. And you can think about the progression in terms of sandpaper grits. I have 3 pieces of sandpaper in front of me, and you will need all 3 of these grits, and I'll talk about what they are. The first grit that I have, I'm going to show you, is 60, and it is a fairly coarse grit. If I were to use this on the styrofoam, I would eat it up in nothing flat. The next grit that we have is 100. This is 100 grit. You'll notice that the number got bigger. It went from 60 to 100. So the higher the number on the sandpaper, the finer it is. And the last piece of sandpaper that we have is 220 grit. Now sandpaper goes way down below 60 and it goes way, 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 way up above 220. But these are going to be the 3 types that we're going to need for this project: 60, 100, and 220. And each of these does different things, and they have to be used in a certain sequence. And it's really important to do them the way that I'm going to describe them. But I just wanted you to know about the 3 types of sandpaper that we're going to use in this process. All right. So I'm sure you remember this. I set it outside today. It's nice and sunny and arid. And in a couple of hours, it dried to the point where I could sand it, which is really awesome. I thought it might take a little longer. It would definitely take a little longer inside, but out in the sun, it was going to dry a lot faster. And it also fell down and broke. And so I got a big chunk there and a couple of pieces of damage here, but I can fix all that. I'm not worried about it. All right, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take the coarsest sandpaper I have, the 60 grit, all right? And I'm going to sand this, and I don't know if you can see this, but as I turn this, you can see the marks that were left by my paintbrush, right? There's little ridges of plaster that are uneven. So my 60 grit sandpaper is going to clean all of those up. But I'm going to be careful because this 60 grit will get into the foam and then I'll be in trouble. But I'm just going to real slowly take this 60 grit sandpaper. And my objective here is to smooth out all the marks, all the brush marks left when I applied the first coat of plaster. This is not going to be a finished sanding. All I'm trying to do is take down the rough surface that existed after I painted the plaster on the foam the first time. Now my goal is not to sand all the way into the foam. That would sort of be counterproductive. Now one thing, oops, I got into it there. That's okay. One thing I am going to do though is I've got to excise these seams. And I think you can see that seam that's running right up the middle. I got to get rid of that because if I try to sand it, it's going to cause me problems later. So I'm just going to physically, surgically remove this. And again, it's going to create, and a big chunk right there of glue. It's going to create a little divot, a little valley in my foam carving that I was so careful to make smooth. But that's okay because the next time, the next application of plaster that I'm going to put on here in a minute is going to fill that up. But the idea is that you want to excise, remove, dig out, carve out, eliminate that raised seam. And it goes all the way up. I know you can't see what I'm doing. That's all right. All right, so I've eliminated that seam all the way up, right? It's gone. Now, I'm going to continue sanding with my 60 grit. I'm going to be careful not to get into, I got into it again, I'm going to be careful not to get into my foam. I do not want to sand foam. Let me repeat myself. I do not want to sand foam. I'm only trying to knock off the ridges created by the paintbrush when I applied plaster the first time. So like I said, this isn't a finished surface. I'm just trying to make it a little smoother. Okay, so I'm not going to do this whole thing. I don't want you to have to sit and watch me do the whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and skip on to the next part. So the next part is I'm going to apply another coat of plaster. All right, and I'm going to do it the same way that I did it the first time. I'm simply going to put it on with a brush. And it should go on more opaque. It should go on a little thicker because now the plaster that was on there below this second coat is dry. So it will pull some of the moisture out of this second coat. So it should go on a little thicker, and you want it to. Now, I'm not trying to leave a bunch of ridges on here, but it's also pretty easy to leave a bunch of ridges on here. And if I've got the damage that I have in this spot, you can see where it fell. I'm just going to work some plaster right into that, knowing that when it dries, I'll be able to sand that smooth. All right, and I'll be able to clean that up and move on. All right, so like I said, I don't want to make you sit and watch me do all this, but I am definitely, I got a big piece of damage there. I am definitely putting on a thicker coat on this second time around. Again, you know, you want to try to keep the ridges to a minimum, the marks left by your paintbrush, because any of those ridges that you leave, you're going to have to sand away later. And you can see that I've got a pretty good thickness on there. And you can also see some of those ridges that I'm leaving from the paintbrush, right? But I want to make a really good effort to put a nice solid second coat on here. So you can see this gouge that I have. I'm just going to fill it up with plaster, paint right over it. Now it'll still show on this first application, or this second application rather, but once it dries again, once it dries to the next level, you'll be able to sand on that. And by the time you put the third coat on, or maybe even the fourth coat on, those divots, that damage will be completely invisible. But I am going to put a nice, healthy second coat on here. And again, I'm trying to some degree to control the ridges. So that I don't put a bunch of things on here that I'm going to have to then sand off later. The smoother I leave this, the less sanding I'm going to have to do. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to jump to the next step, which I obviously can't do on this particular piece that I'm working on right now, but I can do it on some pieces that I started earlier. So I'm going to leave this alone for now. Let this plaster start to dry, and obviously I've got more to put on there. But I've got my second heavier coat on now, and again, I'm trying to avoid leaving too many ridges that I'm going to have to sand away later. All right, so let's kind of fast forward. If I can show you this, and I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but down here, I've already applied a second coat. And it's pretty thick, and you can see I left some of the ridges from the paintbrush. So I'm going to have to clean those off. So I'm going to start with my sanding progression. So I'm going to start with the 60 grit, the coarsest sandpaper I have first. All right. And now you can see I've left marks on this from my paintbrush when I applied the plaster. The goal of the 60 grit is to remove all the marks left by the previous tool. So I want to remove all of the marks I left from the paintbrush. Now the goal of the 100 grit is to remove all the marks of the 60 grit. And the goal of the 220 grit is to remove all the marks of the 100 grit. So if you don't know when to switch to the next piece of sandpaper or the next grit of sandpaper, remember this. Each piece of sandpaper is only supposed to remove the marks from the previous tool, okay? So I'm going to use 60 grit first, and I'm going to eliminate all the marks left by the paintbrush. All right, so bear with me a second. .60 grit sandpaper is pretty aggressive, so pay attention to where you are in the world, right? Don't allow this sandpaper to get into your foam. You should only be using this 60 grit once you've really started, damn it. So I cut through my foam a little bit, that's okay. This wasn't the last coat. But let's pretend that it was the last coat. Let's pretend this is my third coat and probably more likely my fourth coat. So how do I know when I'm done sanding with the 60 grit? You're done sanding with the 60 grit only when you have completely removed all the marks left by the application of the plaster using the paintbrush. Now what you should have is a pretty smooth surface that's covered with a lot of pretty serious scratches from the 60 grit, right? So when you feel like, and I'm not there yet, I'm close. When you feel like you've removed all the marks from the paintbrush and all you have left are scratches from the 60 grit, then it's time to switch to the 100 grit. And I'm pretty close there. I've got a few little marks left, but I'm pretty close. One little tip I will give you, don't rush this. If your plaster is not dry, do not attempt to sand this. Also, don't sand this in your dorm room. You can see it makes a big mess and it gets in the air. You're going to want to sand this outside. You're going to want to sand this someplace where you can clean up. So don't do it in your dorm room. I mean, you know, if your roommate's gone, I suppose you can do it on their bed, but otherwise I probably wouldn't sand in my dorm room. Once I'm done with 60, I'm going to switch to 100, and this should go fast because I'm not taking off big, heavy paintbrush marks. I'm only taking off the tiny little scratches left behind by the 60 grit. Now again, on this example, this is only my second coat, and it's really probably going to take 3 coats to get this finished. But once I've sanded enough to completely remove all the scratches, you can probably see that that's pretty smooth now. Once I've removed all the scratches from the 100 grit, and the very last thing I'm going to do is, once I've removed all the scratches from the 60 grit, the very last thing I'm going to do is take the 220 and remove the scratches from the 100 grit. The other thing that I want to mention to you is do not try, and maybe I already said this and I'm going to show my old age, do not try to sand this when it's wet. And the reason you don't want to sand it when it's wet is because it will clog your sandpaper. And as soon as your sandpaper gets clogged, it's done, it's ruined, you have to get another piece. But if it's dry, it will fall out of your sandpaper and the sandpaper will last you for the whole project. I could do the whole project with these 3 small pieces of sandpaper. So as long as I didn't try to sand it while it was wet. If I try to sand it while it's wet, then I'm going to clog my sandpaper and I will immediately be forced to throw that away and start over. All right, for those of you that want to be particularly successful, I would do my absolute final sanding in a low light situation where you have a directional light source coming across the piece, right? If you're sitting someplace and you got a desk lamp right here shining down across the front of the piece at an angle, every single flaw and scratch is going to jump out if you're in a low light situation with a single directional light source. So if you really want to be successful and you really want to make that surface really perfect, then try to sand in that environment and you'll be able to see every single little flaw. All right, so this 220 surface is all you need for the finished surface. You know, it's nice and it's smooth and all the flaws are gone and it's good to go. Now, obviously the rest of this isn't done. I was really only focusing on that little bit right there so you could see this. All right, so I wish you luck on this. That's really all I have to say. You know, you're gonna put a coat on and then sand, and then put a coat on and then sand. So what I would do is I would put my first coat on, let it completely dry, and I would sand it with 60 grit maybe. I'd put my second coat on and I'd hit it with 60 grit again until it was pretty nice. Then I'd put my third coat on and hit it with 60 grit. Now after 3 coats, you might have developed enough plaster surface to sort of feel like, maybe I'm getting close to being done. Once you feel like you've applied your very last coat, then you're going to go through the sanding progression. You're going to start with 60, you're going to go to 100, and you're going to finish with 220. You do not have to go through this progression on each layer, only the last layer, right? So if I knew I was going to put more plaster here, I wouldn't have bothered with the 120 or the 220 because that would have just been wasting time. I would have cleaned it up with the 60, put my next layer on, let that dry. And if I had 3 on and I felt like I really had covered all my blemishes and flaws, now I could go ahead and sand it with 60, sand it with 100, and sand it with 220, and I would be down to this surface and I would be done. All right, I wish you luck on this. One thing I really want to mention, spend some time and go back and look at those student outcomes. I did a little PowerPoint in there that shows samples from this project for 100 years or something like that. And there's some really good ones in there, and I hope they inspire you and challenge you to make yours as nice as those are. But spend your time, look at those, get inspired, and then finish this up, and good luck to you.